So recently, I decided to refresh my memory on those issues I researched, which were, in a manner of speaking, related to any possible litigations I might have. So I read the book titled Clinton, Bush, and CIA Conspiracies, which was published by Shaun Atwood. In the book, Shaun lays out how Gary Webb began to uncover the CIA's involvement in drug running, whereby the CIA used Mexican cartels as a conduit to import cocaine. In one instance, he writes of how Gary uncovered a situation where an individual by the name of Rafael Cornejo was employed or contracted by the CIA. There is one instance in which Rafael was under the impression that an individual by the name of Blandon was going to testify in a manner to assist Rafael in his defense. But Gary would inform Raphael's attorney that Blandon was colluding with the prosecutor's office to provide coverage for the CIA and would be testifying against Raphael. At a pretrial hearing, the federal prosecutor would deny knowledge of any information or testimony given by Blandon, and because of this denial of any knowledge, the case would get dismissed. This form of gatekeeping is done by the Justice Department, which is very similar to what I've been alleging in regards to an investigative cover story brought against me to create a pretext for the FBI to look the other way of any forms of wrongdoing on the part of the Clinton administration. As a matter of tracking all suspicious deaths that have links to the CIA and their drug running, Shaun gets into circumstances by which an investigator for the DEA by the name of Kiki Camarena was murdered by the Mexican cartel members who had received the go-ahead from the CIA. Because Mexico was the go-between for the flow of drugs into the United States, Kiki would have to uncover the network of cartels that would uncover how Mexican politicians had been bought off and that former police officers would pledge an allegiance to the Mexican cartels. Or in one instance, Felix Gallardo would start his own cartel and get into the drug trade. He would also make investments into media organizations to control the flow of information, which is much like the CIA does today. In the book, he also gets into the Arkansas connection, which is used as a landing pad for all the drugs that were shipped to Mexico, from Mexico. Because the CIA and its contractors would use people just barely out of high school, it would become hard for the CIA to silence the media. Due to the fact that Bill Clinton was then governor of Arkansas, and also had a brother by the name of Roger Clinton, who was directly involved in drug trafficking with the CIA, that would tarnish Bill's image just a bit. Bill Clinton would also have his image tarnished by many unsolved murders, actually. The chain of unsolved murders would start with two guys just out of high school that have often been referred to as the boys on the tracks, which is where they were found under mysterious circumstances. As witnesses such as Keith Coney would start to come forward with information about state and local law enforcement that were involved, Keith would have his neck slashed and would die from those injuries. There would also be another witness who was assigned to take aerial photos of the tracks where the two were found. He would end up stabbed 115 times, and the motives would be traced back to Sheriff Steed. As an individual by the name of Shane Smith began to reveal information about this individual's death, police would go into damage control and put the murder on Shane Smith. There would also be another murder to silence people, only this time it would be an individual by the name of Greg Collins, who was shot 3 times on January 22nd of 1989. In April of 1989, Booney Barden, who knew the two were killed at the tracks, would end up dead with gunshots in his body and found at the city dump. Others who would be murdered under suspicious circumstances include Richard Winters and Jordan Kettleson. In chapters 11 and 12, Shaun gets into how local prosecutors were personally involved in the drug trade that went on in Arkansas. The prosecutor's name is Dan Harmon, and I guess this would be a prime example of how the federal government can be weaponized when the civil servants become the criminals. Dan Harmon, who was always suspected of being directly involved in the boys' murders that were found at the tracks, would attempt inserting himself into the investigation, getting himself appointed as special prosecutor, whereby he would run coverage for himself. What Dan Harmon does in terms of using his position as a prosecutor sounds a lot like what Ken Starr did for the CIA. Ken Starr was the nephew of Cornelius Starr, who handled the money laundering operations through AIG. And what Ken Starr would do is investigate the Clintons in a manner that would minimize blowback, but he would try and bloody them up just enough so they can claim a right-wing conspiracy and act like they are warring with each other. While Dan was investigating the murders on the railroad tracks, it would come to light that he too was under investigation for weaponizing his position to obstruct investigations of other drug traffickers. There are also instances of Dan Harmon targeting Jean Duffy, who was tasked to investigate trafficking of drugs through Arkansas, in which it became apparent that she was getting too close to Dan Harmon. So Dan would have an arrest warrant issued against her, which is a fine example of how the Justice Department is weaponized. In May of 1993, Deputy Brown was tasked to investigate the murders of the two found at the railroad tracks. In the course of his investigation, it would be substantiated that a woman by the name of Charlene Wilson was involved romantically with Dan Harmon, and that she had definitive knowledge that Dan Harmon was at the railroad tracks when the two were murdered. She would also offer up evidence to the fact that she did drug deliveries to Roger Clinton and Dan Harmon. She would also offer up testimony to the fact that Keith McCaskill was present for the murders of Don Henry and Kevin Ives. Eventually, a witness list would make its way to the State Attorney General's office, and the State Attorney's office would tip off Dan Harmon about Charlene Wilson and what she was up to. So Dan Harmon would seek to have Charlene Wilson arrested. And as he was doing so, he would make threats saying specifically, if you ever brought up my name regarding a past dealings, I would take you down. With former police officers in Mexico who became involved in the drug trade, some of them would end up becoming informants. One of those individuals is Raul, who would reveal he was riding in the car with Kiki Camarena, in which he was taken to Caro Quintero's residence, where he was tortured to death because Quintero was under the impression that Kiki had stolen money from him, when in fact it was the Mexican delivery person who stole the money. Present for the torture of Kiki that resulted in his death was a U.S. consulate employee, Felix Rodriguez, who worked for the CIA, Cabinet Secretary Bartlett Diaz, Defense Secretary Arevalo Garducci, Interpol head Miguel Aldana, DFS head Sergio Espino Lardin, and also present was Juan Roman Ballesteros, who provided the airlines to traffic the drugs. Raoul would also offer up knowledge that Lawrence Harrison, who worked for the CIA, also worked with Don Neto, who was embedded with the Mexican DFS. According to Gonzalez Cardona, he would reveal that Kiki was murdered because he was ruining a good thing the Mexican police had going for them, along with the politicians and army officers who were taking payoffs from either the CIA or the Mexican cartels. Aside from the obvious that the CIA gets assistance from foreign governments that will be beneficial to their agenda of drug trafficking, it should also be noted that they have a long history of partnering with the Italian mafia, which dates back to World War II. Often when you have crime families partnered with the CIA to run their operations, you might have some of those family members wanting to run for political office or pursue employment as prosecutors for the Justice Department, which would seem to have everything to do with the weaponization of the federal government and its agencies. Who those families are that the CIA is partnered with is for another time, but I think it's safe to say the Bushes and Clintons are two prime families, including the Rothschilds, Rockefellers, and Brofmans. As Congress holds hearings on weaponization of the government, let's also demand answers as to why the CIA thinks it's a good idea to be partnered with mafia crime families, many of whom enter into politics. Along with the weaponization of the government, let's also be cognizant of how the federal government attempts to expand its powers and how they may legislate away their powers to third parties, in which they would centralize their power and operate in a monopolistic manner with the blessings of the federal government. For example, we have the creation of the Federal Reserve, which is composed of member banks that exert centralized control over the economy, create bubbles, and exit those markets right at the top before anyone else can exit the markets. If you want solutions to the problem, look for a strategy that decentralizes control of third parties who have been gifted control through legislation. Keep an eye out for escalation of surveillance capabilities of individuals' banking, and keep an eye out for the escalation of surveillance of political speech. It is very sad that Donald Trump was shot at in an attempt to kill him, but do not let him have free reign over any future legislation that might otherwise be hard to get passed, such as trying to regulate speech in the name of unity. Donald Trump is known for his claims that he is being done in by the deep state and loves to push this narrative. What his son Don Jr. has done is prop up a Bush family member on Pete Santilli's podcast while claiming his father is being done in by the deep state. This seems to be in direct conflict. However you choose to define the deep state, your definition should include how the Mossad and Israel are part of the apparatus. While Bill Clinton was involved in very shady dealings involving drug trafficking at the behest of the CIA, and there are plenty of suspicious deaths that are linked to him, there is enough evidence to suggest that Bill Clinton became a liability to the Mossad, as Clinton tried to push for peace in the Middle East between Palestine and Israel. So there are endless theories about how Israel sought to facilitate the impeachment of Bill Clinton. There are also theories regarding how Israel sought to eavesdrop on the White House through backdoors and softwares. With Donald Trump being so quick to jump on the train of thought that has momentum, he sought to seize on the JFK assassination, which I delve into in my book. When he won the election, he kind of forgot about the releasing of JFK records, and nothing ever came of that. Also interesting is the fact that Donald Trump received assistance from Israel in 2016, and they were the source of the election interference. Not Russia, not China, not Facebook, but the Mossad. So, basically, of the 33 elections that Israel has sought to influence through their Unit 17, they were successful in 27 of those elections. There is plenty of evidence of how the German Nazis were allowed to infiltrate into the CIA after World War II. It is from this Nazi influence comes the push for the intelligence agencies to traffic drugs in the name of national security and fund secret operations which the public had no knowledge of. It is also of notable interest that the CIA used the Mossad to traffic these drugs, which is supported by a source at the Middle East Research Information Project. Shortly after the Nazi assets were allowed to infiltrate into the CIA, along with the New York Times, which is a Jewish-owned organization, sought to pursue a coup in Iran to remove a constitutional government to install a pro-Nazi dictatorial rule in Iran. Kind of interesting. So, if the public were aware of the historical facts of how the CIA was always pro-Nazi, while at the same time being pro-Israel, the public might want to figure out things for themselves and demand accountability of the CIA, who has direct influence over the world's foreign policy that involves the United States. To wield such power and influence over foreign policy is the weaponization of an agency that is part of the United States. If there is no consistencies in the views that are espoused by an individual, there is no reason to consider their views as being credible. With Robert Kennedy Jr. being involved in the Trump election campaign and future administration, he's in clear alignment with Ed Dowd, who was a former Goldman Sachs employee, like Anthony Scaramucci and Kellyanne Conway, who were both a part of his administration. It's like the powers that be who want to discontinue the reign of the US dollar want a foothold in the replacement of Bitcoin. So we basically have podcasters pushing the idea that Bitcoin will take down the deep state, yet deep state financiers are looking to position themselves in Bitcoin and reap the profits from it. So basically, Robert Kennedy Jr. is looking to play kingmaker, crowning certain capitalists with enormous wealth derived from Bitcoin. As capitalists exit Bitcoin, they will basically leave people holding bags when in fact this Bitcoin thing is just a mass deception to increase the surveillance capabilities of the deep state and those who are in partnership with them. If Biden wanted to possibly expose Donald Trump as a charlatan, I would release all CIA documents pertaining to how the CIA and Mossad are intertwined, and release all documents that support Israel's role in the JFK assassination. And if he were to do that, we would see how Donald Trump's definition of the deep state would change. As Stu Peters once said, they have their tentacles in just about everything and just can't escape them. Hence the name of my book titled The Octopus and My Entanglement with It. Having researched one issue the CIA is notoriously known for, and how the Justice Department seeks to run coverage for the CIA with the assistance of corrupt prosecutors who engage in criminal conspiracies themselves. It is quite clear that the CIA expects not to be challenged by credible reporters. They more or less expect reporters to toe the line if they want to continue earning an income through reporting. And of course, reporters must report on things their producers want to continue to get viewers tuning in. For there to be no critical thinking or attempts to connect the dots, these reporters must be negligent in their obligation to the public. It is not their obligation to control the masses and convince the public that the federal government and its agencies can do no wrong, but rather to expose the wrongdoing. I, for one, can attest to the fact that I overheard an individual claiming to have a friend who came across documents that supported the fact that the CIA had control over the media, and these documents were found in the Office of Naval Intelligence. I think it's very interesting that people who are currently journalists are on record saying that they previously worked for naval intelligence, or that they have family members who worked for intelligence agencies. I don't know how you could find them credible, but apparently it's very common. Because the government sought the fact that the federal government seeks to control the narrative became very apparent as COVID-19 swept around the world. Because the federal government sought to control so many aspects of the narrative, along with providing a solution to the virus in the form of a vaccine, they have just created the perception of their intent to do harm to the public, while attempting to provide layers of immunity to all participants involved through legislation, while lawmakers enacted exemptions for themselves. When you have a government that enacts laws that provide immunity under the banner of national security, enabling them to conceal secrets and conduct any range of experiments under the banner of national security, you're basically allowing these people to exert control over the intel agencies to commit all forms of crimes while enriching themselves. One commonly known instance of this is how the CIA was formed after World War II, and those Americans who had pro-Nazi leanings allowed Nazis from Germany to infiltrate into the CIA and were provided legal protection. With this infiltration into the intel agencies came a strategy to enrich oneself through the sale of drugs, using the Italian mafia as a conduit to distribute those drugs. This cozy relationship originated out of World War II. Clearly, if you have an intel agency committing all forms of crimes, they're tasked with deciding foreign policy relative to the intel they have collected. You would have to question the credibility of the claims and intel collected by those agencies, knowing they would tweak the information in a manner that benefits them to enable them to continue with their current actions. Currently, in current politics, our current elected president seems to be hinting at the ushering in of a new era of finance that includes Bitcoin, which would be a one world currency, which is very reminiscent of the Bush era and a one world government. So basically, we have an individual who wants to push a one world currency concept for more centralization over transactions, yet he carries on about how he's being targeted by the deep state. These issues clearly are in conflict with each other. We all need to understand the definition of the deep state because just about anyone can say they are being done in by the deep state or their political enemies. As a matter of reviewing facts, we have the CIA, which allowed for the infiltration of German Nazis, who then pursued a drug trafficking strategy for enrichment of themselves, while implementing a eugenics plan to rid the planet of undesirables. It is also a fact that the CIA pursued this drug trafficking strategy with the Israeli Mossad. So what the CIA does is with the assistance of the Mossad. It is also a fact that both the Bush and Clinton family were involved in the drug trade, along with banking to launder the money that was made through the drug sales. Amidst the finger pointing at Donald Trump for being a Nazi, we also have Donald Trump loving Israel and hiring all those who love Israel. Clearly, Israel is tied into the deep state apparatus, and any policy that would directly benefit Israel would in fact benefit the deep state. Donald Trump is not a victim of the deep state, but rather he is part of the deep state who is devoted to Israel. What the public needs to do is make a list of all podcasters and people in the media who put the narratives out that Donald Trump is bad because he's going to abandon allies like Israel. Once the public starts to understand that Israel is part of the deep state, they can begin to understand how and why Israel is commonly referred to as the puppet state. Also commonly associated with the deep state is the need to expand the use of surveillance and to have backdoors to allow for spying by intel agencies. I have personally delved into the Promise Software conspiracy because there were links to Vince Foster's death. It was always my assertion that I was targeted by the Clinton administration for investigation as part of a cover story to have a pretext to mislead the public with false narratives to excuse missing records from Vince Foster's office and missing Whitewater records. In order to have an expansion of surveillance, we need to have justification, and to have justification, we need fear and a perceived threat. The start of the public sphere began in 1988 when Iraq was pursuing a strategy to abandon the US dollar. So we had justification to go to war with Iraq, who was once an ally, or at least an enemy of our enemy, that being Iran. So the war went on through the 1990s, and finally a new threat arose on September 11th of 2001. But to have a credible threat to the US public, these hijackers armed with box cutters would need to be allowed to enter the US, and somehow they would have to be tied to Al-Qaeda. It has already been substantiated that the hijackers who were allowed into the country also received assistance from family members of the Saudi royal family. It is also factual that the Saudi family has ties to the Bin Laden family. Also factual is the fact that the Bush family has ties to the Saudi family and the Bin Laden family, just like the Kushners have ties to Benjamin Netanyahu. I believe the Prime Minister does state that he once stayed at the residence of the Kushners. When you have the federal government pushing a narrative of concern about disinformation or misinformation, you should probably take a look at the crimes that are about to be swept under the carpet. You should also zero in on those podcasters and media influencers who support the idea of the government or a third party acting as the arbiter of what the perception of facts are. Since when did controlling what people believe become of importance to the federal government, or are they just going to claim it's some kind of concern that falls under the banner of national security. Who wants a clown state deciding what national security is anyway? The fact is, many people in the truth movement, many of whom are podcasters or media influencers, will have guests on their shows who are rather selective about the facts they put out, and they try and put a nice spin on the facts to make the federal government look not so untrustworthy. So it leaves the question why these podcasters wouldn't challenge them for not being fully truthful and editing facts. As a matter of getting into what I addressed to this federal clerk in the Southern District of New York after placing a call directly to Justice Wood, the subject of NBC targeting me was brought up. I also touch on how I started to speak out against those who I believed would hinder my legal concerns. These efforts to discredit those who I believed were the source of NBC's harassment started shortly after those two versions of events I had previously discussed. One of the versions of events has links to Christy DeVoe and possibly this Wheeler clown from the Morgantown, West Virginia area. The other cause and effect has links to Mara Davis, as I previously expressed. I had also expressed my desire to backtrack, given the fact that those West Virginia acquaintances were not the only ones I thought would need to be discredited. I was also suspicious of people I knew from Somers High School and possibly faculty members. I thought they would pose some kind of obstacle to me. So having touched on these two core issues of NBC and Somers High School, that triggered a memory of how I had watched a TV movie, a made-for-TV movie. And I thought the made-for-TV movie had some links to this NBC correspondent who previously worked for them. It is my assertion to the clerk that there were scenes that were so strikingly similar to things I either said or did that there was no way that this reporter would be able to deny the fact that this movie was intended to depict my likeness. And I also go on to suggest that any slanderous slants to the portrayal could be disproven. And I also go on to suggest that I could establish a pattern on the part of NBC and any of its affiliates to target me in an attempt to psyop me or deter me from any legal actions against the federal government. Because I was attending meetings in Chappaqua when the book I authored was published, it was pretty clear that I was going to get some opposition from people. I had given a copy to a person by the name of Anthony, and I also gave a copy to Dolly Hertz, who was my sponsor. If Dolly Hertz was to be resourceful, she would have sought out Jewish members of the group to form some kind of allegiance against me and my legal objectives. Possible individuals who she may have sought to align herself with might be Barbara Spiegel, Mike Jacoby, an individual by the name of Dave, who was a police officer or captain at the Pleasantville Police Department, and Dave also had links to Anthony. She may have also sought an allegiance with an individual by the name of Dennis Hart Jr. and Michael O'Sullivan Jr. It would also turn out that Michael O'Sullivan had two parents in the support group as well. Both parents seemed to have issues with me, but it seemed to be more with his father, Michael O'Sullivan Sr. Michael O'Sullivan Sr.'s wife also had a sponsee by the name of Annie, who I was friends with, and who lived in Ossining. So, for whatever reason, somebody thought they would put it in Michael O'Sullivan Jr.'s head that I was interested in some woman he was also pursuing and would end up marrying. I believe these people wanted to stir the pot and turn him against me. I would have to guess that Dennis Hart Jr. May have been involved with that. So from someone who attended AA meetings in Chappaqua, they formulated some kind of strategy to discredit me and those views I lay out by making allegations to Secret Service in the hopes of their obligation to protect Bill Clinton would prevail and hinder me. So basically, we have an instance in which I believe acquaintances from West Virginia University were the sources to NBC's original harassment of me. And we also have Dennis Hart Jr. attending AA meetings at Chappaqua, trying to stir the pot and turn people against me. And I suspect they would have turned towards NBC to, try and discredit me. But obviously, there is reason to suspect that NBC was already colluding with the Clinton administration, in which the Clinton administration would feed information to NBC reporters, and NBC reporters would have the obligation to protect their sources and forever stick to that opinion. So if you consider what I believe to be the modus operandi regarding my concerns, consider major political scandals like the JFK assassination or the 9/11 terrorist attacks. There is enough reason to consider that people in the government may have sought to act as sources to the media to obtain protection from them, that maybe they have sought to influence the media's perception on facts regarding the JFK assassination and the 9/11 terrorist attacks. It's a very cozy relationship they have going for themselves. The whole point of my advocating my legal concerns was that I was being targeted by people, was to wake up people to the fact that if I was being targeted for an investigative cover story, that what if these federal agencies tasked with investigating would seek to run coverage for politicians who may have been considered as suspects in crimes or whatever. Any investigations into past politicians in which nothing came of them should be considered faulty, based on my feelings that they would run coverage for these politicians. As a result of some of the media coverage from some of my videos I've made, and my contact made with Justice Kimba Wood, in which I had spoken to the clerk who returned my call, the Justice Department has admitted to wrongdoing, and NBC has admitted to wrongdoing as well for their part in the collusion with the FBI and the Clinton administration, and possibly other administrations. Obviously, Obama administration, the collusion continued through there. And so nothing has come as of yet regarding finalizing these wrongdoings and the dismissals from the Justice Department. And there have been no monetary damages. So I would assume I'm going to have to take legal action sometime in the future. So that's basically it. So thank you for listening, and share this video with everyone.